Hi, everyone. I'm attorney Donna DiMaggio Berger, and this is Take It to the Board, where we speak condo and HOA. Over the last few weeks, many of us have been looking up at the sky more often, with Jupiter and Venus shining brightly and reports of Chinese spy balloons and possible UFO sightings. While you were looking up, you may have caught sight of a UAS or a UAV. These are acronyms for an unmanned aerial system and an unmanned aerial vehicle, which are better known as drones. Perhaps you've seen one of these devices flying around a beach, a park, or even in your neighborhood. My two guests today are well-versed in drones, how they were developed, what they can do, what problems they solve, what problems they cause, and where this technology is headed. Chris Tahn is the CEO and founder of Pelican Drones and the co-founder of Rocket Drones. Pelican Drones is based in Pensacola, Florida, and serves the greater Gulf Coast area. Pelican Drones was the first drone company in the Florida Panhandle to become commercially licensed by the FAA in 2015. Chris initially focused his operations on aerial photos and videos, but quickly expanded the services that Pelican Drones offers. Today, their services include a variety of ground videography and photography, 360 imaging, industrial inspections, traffic and parking studies, 3D mapping, construction progression shots, as well as drone sales and training. Chris's new business, Rocket Drones, brings the exciting world of drone racing to middle schools and high schools across the country. Chris graduated from the University of Memphis and holds a Department of Transportation remote pilot license. Also joining us today is attorney Neil Johnston. Neil is a member of the Alabama law firm of Hand Arundel LLC, where he leads the real estate, land use, and timber practice group. Neil attended Southwestern at Memphis, Rhodes College, as well as University College in Oxford, England, and earned his JD at the University of Alabama School of Law. Neil's varied practice areas include issues pertaining to water, wetlands, stormwater, oysters, endangered species, timber, turkeys, cultural resources, cane poles, and crickets, as well as today's topic, UAVs or drones. Neil is a fellow of the American College of Real Estate Lawyers, the 2014 chairman of the Alabama chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council, and he and his wife Ashley built the first certified LEED Silver waterfront resilient and energy efficient residence on Mobile Bay. He's very active in public service and has received numerous awards for his work in the fields of conservation, environmental law, and education, including being named the Mobile Environmental Lawyer of the Year for 2011 and 2014. So with those two illustrious and lengthy introductions, Chris and Neil, welcome to Take It to the Board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to have you. And as I said at the outset, we've been all looking up a lot more in the skies lately. So I think this topic is going to be very timely.
Absolutely.
So Chris, let's start with you. Let's start with the basics. What's a drone? How does it operate?
So a drone is an unmanned aerial vehicle, or otherwise known as a UAV, which essentially translates into a remote-controlled robot that flies. That robot can also be autonomous in the sense of the programming that exists there. So we can set it on a predetermined mission to do mapping or to search for a certain pattern and so on and so forth. So it has a wide range of either being controlled by the remote operator or by software.
But it's always unmanned, correct?
It is always unmanned, yes.
So I've heard both of the terms, the UAV and UAS, in connection with drones. What do those terms mean? And where does the term drone come from?
Sure. So the UAS and UAV, basically UAV is the physical drone itself, the flying apparatus. The UAS is basically the culmination of the pilot, the remote controller, the software that flies and interacts with the pilot and the drone. So it is the entirety of the system, including the drone. And ultimately, the drone word it kind of stemmed from more the military application that has really, started some of this technology and has allowed it to grow into the consumer markets.
So, Neil, I want to ask you, what do these things look and sound like? I hear they're very noisy. I've seen one from far. I've never gotten up close.
There are numerous models or designs of different types of drones, whether they're large drones or they're small drones. Mostly what we are familiar with are small UASs, or small drones. Very popular to have a quadcopter, which has 4 rotors, a vertical takeoff and landing. They have a whirring sound. It's sort of a droning sound, and it's something that once you hear one, you will recognize any others that come. They're not quite as loud as they used to be, but you could have a quad. You could have something with multiple rotors. You could have a fixed wing that actually looks like a remote controlled airplane, and that may have different applications also.
And the biggest one can be how big, the smallest one can be how small.
If we're looking at a regulated aircraft that is a drone, anything smaller than 55 pounds would be considered and regulated under the small drone regulations. Anything less than half a pound would be a nano or a mini drone. Anything over 55 pounds is a large drone, and probably would not see that in the hobbyist area. And many commercial drone operators use those that are small and less than 55 pounds, including whatever they are carrying. And today we're talking about aerial drones, but there are also ground drones, and some ground drones can also be aerial. They have a dual purpose, or you've got underwater drones. So we're not just limited to flying the drones. They could be most anywhere. So not only do you look up, but you need to look out and look down and look in.
So Chris, off to you. Tell us about these ground drones.
Neil's exactly right. There's a lot of different use case scenarios, starting with the land side of things. The oil industry out in West Texas has utilized some land-based sample collection drones that are basically fancy four-wheelers that the drillers may put their soil samples in that drone, and it will go off to a testing center, and then that'll return like clockwork the next day or the next required time segment. A lot of folks might have already seen one of the most famous water drones, which is the SpaceX barge that is unmanned that retrieves the SpaceX rockets when there are water landings. There's also, of course, one of the more famous drones that is, in our space with the military that a lot of folks have heard of, which is the Global Hawk or the Predator drone, which, you've mentioned earlier, it does stay a little bit higher up, so it's not seen and known about. But yeah, there's a wide range of drone uses beyond aerial.
So we're going to delve into Hollywood for a second. So we look at, movies like Titanic. Was that legitimate technology? The drone that went into the ship? And, again, we're talking Hollywood. So I'm sure there's a fair amount of fantasy involved. But are there aquatic drones that do shipwreck recovery? There
are aquatic drones. The biggest difference of those, they do need to be tethered because of the limitations of radio signals and such. But those underwater drones are not only for recovery, but also for littoral mapping and other various things. A ship may deploy a torpedo-looking like drone that actually is a mapping drone for underwater terrain and so on. So they're used in a wide variety of ways. And one of the areas that our local residents of South Florida may recognize is FPL is highly engaged with drone operations. Here at the latest hurricane that hit the south of Tampa area, a brand new FPL unmanned airplane drone was deployed. It was a full-size Cessna, but completely unmanned. And on board was a variety of sensors, including LiDAR and various camera applications that basically would go over the damaged areas and get better insight on what's needed to repair those areas so that they can speed up the logistics of, oh my gosh, we're going to need a dozen power poles over here and a dozen transformers and so on and so forth. And FPL has also expanded their drone usage where up here in the Panhandle, we get text messages that say, hey, your neighborhood is getting ready to be, scanned for vegetation growth on the power lines with a drone, and don't mind the drone. It's just doing its vegetation study there. I have communities that border conservation areas. So they've got a buffer zone where they're not supposed to have certain vegetation, invasive species in that conservation area. Perhaps they don't want homeowners pushing out their fences or their patios into that area. So that makes perfect sense. But Neil, you mentioned regulation. I believe you based it on the weight of the drone. Tell us a little bit about how these drones are regulated, both in terms of size and who can operate them.
Well, going back to the beginning, the drones are considered aircraft. And so the rules, statutes, regulations, federal, that apply to airplanes or aircraft also apply to drones. However, there's a special category for small drones, and the details are in 14 CFR 107, which is recent vintage, back probably 2016. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, is the regulating agency, and taking the cue from Congress from time to time, have come up with regulations that simplified some of the processes, but focused on small drones, those being between 55 pounds on the high side and a half pound on the low side. And those are the ones that we see most often being used by commercial operators or hobbyists. And those are the ones that you find on the shelf, like I said, in the stores or online, and relatively inexpensive, which may be a problem for the regulators. But the regulations do tell you what you can do, when you can do it, who can do it, and what you have to do in order to prove that you are qualified to do it.
So if it's a small drone, you don't need to be licensed as a pilot. Larger drones, if it's over a certain weight in size, you do need to hold a pilot's license.
Actually, anybody that's operating a drone, one will have to register it, so you've got to have a record. It doesn't matter whether it's over 55 pounds or under 55 pounds, unless it's a mini or a nano, which would be less than a half a pound. But I don't do that, but you've got to be trained. And so you have to have some type of certification or license. If you are a licensed air pilot, that may get you in and you may qualify that way. But no, you have to take a knowledge test. You've got to know the law. And not only is this Part 107 dictate how you will operate a small drone, but you're also subject to all of the other airplane regulations or aircraft regulations. And that which brings in, you cannot operate in a reckless manner. You cannot drink while you're operating. You can't interfere with other manned airplane operations.
Neil, who's the enforcement agency if somebody is operating a drone outside those regulations?
That's a good question. And it's very difficult to enforce anything, but it would be the FAA on the federal side or the Department of Justice. It could be state regulatory agency, or it could be a local police department.
So, Chris, I just want to buy my 14-year-old nephew a drone. And everything Neil just said sounds very complicated. If I go to a toy store and buy a drone off the shelf for my 14-year-old nephew, does he need to take any training for that?
Well, he can. So we have had a couple new adjustments to it. And you're absolutely right with the toy element. That's exactly why Neil had mentioned the cutoff at a half pound. And there may even be some additional language in there for sub 250 gram drones, which are oftentimes in the toy category, which, again, we want to streamline those less capable, less threatening drones to the toy category. But ultimately, the FAA has launched what's called a trust certificate. The trust certificate is open to any age, and it is a very streamlined, basic course on mainly drone safety. And upon passing the certification test, the operator will be presented with their certification, and now they can fly in controlled airspace with a drone and abide by those controlled airspace limits. When we're in populated areas or controlled spaces, airspaces, I refer to it, as you get closer to the airport, the altitudes in which you're allowed to fly get lower and lower and lower as you get closer to the airport.
Well, that makes sense. Can you expand a little bit, Chris, on what constitutes controlled airspace? Obviously, airport makes sense, but what else? Let's say I'm in a homeowners association, single family homes. Where's controlled airspace in that situation? So
controlled airspace does reference back to FAA airspace segments, and they are mainly centered around airports and or landing pads for emergency life flight flights at hospitals, for example, and so on. But the actual airspace limitations in the HOA, if it is beyond the FAA airspace concerns of controlled airspace, or even if it is inside of there will be an appropriate altitude prescribed for those operations. It is up to the HOA to implement certain guidelines if they are going to go down this road of addressing drones. Some really interesting ways that we've seen, from coming on site to an HOA community that I have to check in. I have to also arrange ahead of time the knowledge that we're going to be doing a drone flight at a resident's house. That is then documented at their check-in facility. I am given a special tag in case security notices this drone flying and they want to ask me about it. So there are protocols that can be put into place from both the commercial side of people coming onto the property to do drone work, but also from the residential side of the owners that may enjoy flying the drones. One recommendation on that ending part of, let's say, we have a resident that enjoys flying their drone, the HOA may go back to the noise component and set some hours in there. Or they may say that, hey, the drones under a certain weight are less noisy. So let's approve something that, is a smaller class of drone that would cut down on noise, and then say, hey, if you want to fly a larger drone, you could do that at a authorized AMA hobbyist field or outside of controlled airspace somewhere.
Sure. You've got two issues typically in associations pertaining to drones. Invasion of privacy. How dare this drone be flying over my backyard? I'm trying to sunbathe, and now I've got this thing in my face, probably has a camera. So you've got invasion of privacy. You've also got the nuisance, which, Chris, you just spoke to. Noise, if the thing crashes. So, Neil, as our attorney on the panel, what's your advice in terms of drafting and implementing the kind of policy that Chris just suggested when it comes to hobbyist use of drones inside a community? Speak, if you could, to both an HOA, where we've got single-family homes or townhomes, as well as vertical construction. So we've got a multifamily building where, Mrs. Smith may be sitting out on the 12th floor balcony of her unit, and she sees a drone hovering right at about eye level.
First, take a look and see what the restrictions may be on the federal level. Then take a look at your state statutes and whether or not they're right of privacy, what is trespass, what is a nuisance, does it include drone operation? If you're in Florida, for instance, yes, there are some statutes that directly address all of that. If you're in Alabama, not so much as a drone statute, but we have aircraft statutes, and those are pulled in because the drone is an aircraft. If you have single-family housing in your HOA, the policy considerations, one, you should at least have a policy consideration, and you ought to be trying to develop something. Problem is technology, drone technology, and the payload technology is changing every day. Chris made reference to saying that you might want a smaller and specific type written into your policy. However, that's old news. What used to be on the shelf is no longer there because the pixel has changed, or the time of flight may have changed. The battery capacity, instead of solid state or whatever, you've now got lithium that may not only blow up, but it may last longer. So you've got a longer flying time. We're used to about 2 to 3 minutes, or now up to 20 minutes, or what those that are being used by Chris may be a whole lot expanded time frame from that. The drone policy should not be a standalone, although it ought to be very specific in what it addresses.
I can tell you most of my clients in Florida will probably just say no drones. No hobbyist use of drones. It's just an easier policy. They'll carve out an exception for the association to utilize drone technology for inspections. And I want to talk to you, Chris, about that. Unless the statutes are changed to protect owners' rights, consumers' rights to use drones. Like in Florida, we have an electric vehicle provision now in our statute that says that an HOA cannot prevent somebody from installing an electric vehicle charging station in their parking space or in an area over which they have control. I could see something like that happening. I guess, Chris, back to you. Does the drone industry have a strong lobbying group?
They do, backed by a lot of interested parties like Amazon and so on. But yeah, this is kind of a area that, Neil, I might have to lean back on you, but was the case involving privacy and drone, I believe, was it Oklahoma? Or I believe you're a little more familiar with that case. Was there ever any big judgment on that?
You might be talking about the Kentucky case, which was Boggs Meredith in that, and William Meredith, I think it was, the drone killer.
I mean, guys, you got to tell me what drone killer, you got to expand on that.
This was a case back in 2017 in Kentucky, and drone operator, owner, flying a DJI Phantom, which back then was very popular. It was a quadcopter, and Williams Meredith's daughter was outside sunbathing, as I recall, and complained that a drone was flying over several times. Willie got his Benelli shotgun and went out, and it saw the drone. It was hovering. He said very close, shot it. It crashed. He also put on his 45 and had that when the drone owner was coming up to complain. Mr. Meredith asked him to leave. Well, Meredith gets arrested, taken down to state jail, and eventually the judge, listening to the case, listening to the facts from each side, said, well, heck yeah, I do the same thing. You had the right to shoot it. And that was dismissed. A federal lawsuit followed. And eventually the federal court, we thought we were going to find out where private air rights and navigable air rights or federal air rights collide and get some guidance on that. However, the federal court dismissed because of lack of subject matter jurisdiction, said this is a state court deal. And so that's where we're still there.
That's just in one state. Okay, that's not the law in every state. How low was that drone flying when he shot it?
The homeowner, the father, described it as being very low. The operator, Boggs, said he was at least 200 feet, maybe more.
Well, that would make the father a very good shot. It's something that's going to come up more and more often. Well, especially in Florida. We're actually on the precipice of passing a constitutional carry law down here. And we have a lot of people armed, and that's true throughout the nation. And now you've got these drones flying overhead. And, they'll say if it's over my property and I can see it, it's not entitled to be there. But that's not necessarily the case, is it?
The feds argue that they have jurisdiction and can regulate air rights from the ground up, whatever is navigable. So they control the navigable airspace. However, we got the Causey case, too, back in the 50s, I believe, which was in a flight path. And Mr. Causey was a farmer, had a bunch of chickens, whatever, that quit laying because the planes kept flying over and disturbing them. And the court stated that, well, yeah, if you're flying within 360 feet of the ground or Mr. Causey's farm, you're liable.
There are some commercial buildings, Neil, where you can purchase the air rights. I know my father owned a building and he had the air rights to build up. Maybe one of the things we'll see, maybe one of the trends we'll see in real property law moving forward is regular homeowners purchasing air rights.
That may not give them the protection that they're looking for because the aircraft, the drones, will be flying through that air right if there's no fixed structure there.
We may just have given some developers a new revenue source of selling air rights, whether or not you can enforce it against a drone. But it's an interesting concept. Chris, we've been talking about this. What do these things cost?
If we were in the toy class of something under 250 grams, it would be, maybe $100 to $200. But the moment we say, okay, I want to fly with all those bells and whistles of GPS, and I can take my hands off the control and have a conversation with my neighbor while the drone's just hovering, or having those additional camera gimbals to stabilize the footage while the drone is flying, having these proximity sensors so we don't run into obstacles and so on and so forth. Those drones can start out at price ranges around $500 to $1,000. And then, of course, you can get as fancy as you want with getting into thermal and other applications that can reach as high as $20,000 for certain applications.
So let's talk about associations who want to use a drone to confirm whether or not there's a violation. I had a high-rise client, and they suspected that an owner, I think it was on the 7th or 8th floor, had flammable material on the balcony. The owner would not allow access into the unit. And they said, let's just get a drone. Let's just fly a drone over the balcony and confirm whether or not it's there. I had an HOA, similar situation with a shed in the backyard that they don't allow sheds, couldn't see because they had high shrubbery around. What does it typically cost, Chris, for an association to rent a drone and have you go out and operate it and confirm these violations?
Sure. So, when we get into HOA requests, depending on the size or scope of the area of focus, we try to simplify things with an hourly rate and then kind of guesstimate on the hours needed to conduct that operation. Usually we're at $350 for our first hour and $250 for each hour moving forward. And that basically is going to have a deliverable system of, okay, if it's imagery needs of a certain area, then we will upload that imagery to an online Google Drive link and deliver it. And now it can be easily shared with whoever needs that information. But yes, that is, a service that we offer to HOAs for a variety of reasons.
So, Neil, if somebody wants to obtain the imagery, whether it's video or still photos that have been collected by a drone, have you ever come across that in terms of a demand for, evidentiary proof on a case collected by a drone?
Yes, I have, but in different situations, and the imagery is digital most of the time, and at least nowadays, probably totally. It could be thermal, but all of this could be considered surveillance, whether it's legal or illegal. It can be hacked. You may have a third party that has to process it for the software that you have. The information could end up in a lot of different places and could be accessed by people that shouldn't have access to it. This gets to, if you talk about HOA, it gets to your data privacy policy also. And you can see how these things have all got to work together. And like I say, the drone policy is part of the overall and doesn't stand on its own because it still relates to some of these other things that maybe the HOA already has, but they've left out the drone part.
You've both mentioned thermal. Is that just the imagery where you've got the body heat? You're not seeing faces, you're not seeing details, you're just seeing temperature?
Correct. The use cases for thermal in like an HOA environment, it's used for leak detection. So if you have a complicated leak that we don't know where it's originating, that can show us where moisture is present at its source, and it'll show a different temperature reading there. And it's also used for a variety of other reasons, thermal inspections for solar panels. We can see any imperfections in the panels that are limiting their optimal performance. We also, obviously, search and rescue uses thermal quite a bit for, finding subjects in densely populated areas of vegetation and so on. Thermal has become a very versatile tool or payload on the drones.
But if you're worried about privacy and somebody's using thermal, I don't think you have to be that worried. All you're going to see is a red blob, correct?
Depends on what you're looking for, but that would be considered surveillance too.
Well, what do hobbyists tend to have more, the thermal or the actual photography?
The photography drone is the most popular model, and it is worth mentioning that though the imagery is very clear and 4K video and nice resolution photos, there's often very few drones with a significant amount of zoom. So oftentimes what the pilot sees is almost what you would see from your eyeballs type of zoom, but 200, 300 feet up. So people do look like little specks in some cases, where some people may think that they are looking at their eye color or something from 200 feet up. So it's certainly not like that, but it could be with proper unlimited budget and zoom stuff on a drone. It certainly could be.
A lot of times in our associations, we have security cameras. So if there's a dispute between owners, they'll say, we want to see the security footage on this day. Let's say that it's the association on that day happened to be doing a roof inspection, for instance. What's the range for the typical drones? Would they be capturing things around?
Sure. So there are mapping missions. For example, we had a brand new community reach out to us about doing a roof photo session to strategically treat which homes had leaf buildup in their gutters, and have just one guy strategically go around to only those roofs in need. And the range is basically limited to our line of sight. So we can't fly the drone beyond our line of sight, even though the drone is capable of going further. Let's call it, the average drone may be capable of anywhere from a half mile to a mile. And that varies so vastly because of what kind of environment you're in. If you're in a highly dense urban environment with lots of Wi-Fi and apartments and structures, you may have less range versus if you're flying right over the ocean and there's nothing obstacle in your way and electronic signals are low. So it can be quite a reach if desired, but most of the time, if you're following the proper rules and safe protocols, line of sight flight is the limitation.
You know, we both had the horrific Champlain Towers South collapse down here in Surfside. We now have new safety laws in Florida that require periodic engineering. Can a drone determine whether or not a building is sinking as opposed to having to do a subsurface inspection?
It can, with the payloads that we've gone through. One which was mentioned was LiDAR. LiDAR is essentially a laser measurement sonar kind of system in a way. A lot of our new cars that have automatic braking systems is powered by LiDAR technology. And essentially, LiDAR is special because it can penetrate vegetation and get down to the surface level. So I'd say the answer to your question is yes, if there's a baseline scan that's been done in previous years that can be used as a again, the baseline report. And then we can move into measuring the changes over time. And if that is indeed beyond the tolerance of concern for something like a structural issue. There's also ground versions of these LiDAR scanners that can go on tripods. Not everything has to go on a drone, but ultimately these are some of the very accurate tools out there to measure movements over time.
Neil, let me ask you about liability. Let's start with the liability of the operator. Okay. Person is flying a drone around, loses control, crashes, falls on somebody's car or somebody's head, injures the property or injures the person.
Who is the operator?
Just a hobbyist. So it's a hobbyist, okay?
Oh, we've got those that try to comply. So you've got the registration. You've got numbers that will be put on the drone to identify and are required to be there. Yes, there's liability for the operator. There may be liability for the parent, depending on the age of the operator, 14, 13, if it's 10. Chris, there used to be an age limit on hobby, as I recall. I think it was 13. I'm not so sure there's a limit now under the new regs.
It could be the manufacturer who's liable as well. Have there been any cases so far about drones that have been defective?
Yes, and most of them don't comply with OSHA anyway, but I haven't seen any OSHA citations on it, although I've spoken about it before to surprise a lot of operators. But most of the rotors that are operating and allowing the lift for the drone are unprotected and sharp and have caused lots of problems. You do see some of the smaller ones because you do have very young children operating these that now have something that looks like a protective screen around the rotors, but they're easily removed.
Let's talk about the type of insurance. So if you were a hobbyist or even the association is using a drone for their purposes, what kind of insurance coverage? I assume you need a separate rider.
You do. We actually recommend a specific type of policy that's going to be beyond your local insurance provider for things like homeowners and car insurance. It's actually an aviation policy. We use a group out of Georgia, I believe, by the name of Air Capital Insurance. And basically, there's three main providers within the aircraft provider world. And they've heavily expanded to cover drones for commercial uses for annual policies, which would probably run you right under $1,000 for the year for $1 million liability policy for someone that's newly starting out as a licensed commercial pilot. But in the case where it's just a very rare occurrence that perhaps the HOA wants to have extra coverage for the day, there have been some new hybrid policies that have launched through the app world where there is a one called Verifly, and Verifly allows us to purchase a policy for an hour, for a day, for a couple days or a week. So it's very friendly for the either drone pilots that's just starting out and putting their finger into the work world or the occasional commercial application of an organization like an HOA.
So Neil, I want to get back really quickly to shooting down that drone. So owner shoots it down. Does the owner have any liability for the destruction of property, assuming it was flying right outside their balcony or over their backyard?
Depending on whether or not you're related to the judge or jury or federal prosecutor, yes, you do. Can you shoot the drone? Yes, you can, but there are consequences. The drone being an aircraft, there is federal law and state laws that say you cannot shoot an aircraft. All right, so you violated federal law, you violated state law already. You can't interfere with their flights. You shot at them. And this is criminal law. And there would be civil liability also. I have not found a rider or endorsement on an insurance policy, even through some of the companies that Chris has just mentioned, that covers shooting drones.
Just from what I'm hearing you both say, if an association is going to use a drone or allow, let's say, I know realtors often use drones now to photograph the property when they're putting it online. Let people know, right? So there's no surprises. I think part of the problem here is people get shocked and startled if they see one of these devices flying very close to them or what they perceive to be their protected space. So if you're an association, you know that somebody's going to be operating a drone in the community, either because it's, to collect photos because a home is going up for sale, or it's for a roof inspection or whatever else it might be. Let people know. I assume you both agree that advance notification is probably the way to go.
Yes, having this spelled out in your policy as specific as you can, but you've got to review it and you've got to update it. The question should be, should the homeowner association or the board own a drone and operate the drone for these things or hire a third party? I would say that you need to hire a third party like Pelican Drones. In order to do so, take some of that liability off, but then the board has to protect itself from Pelican Drones and update their insurance, make sure they're covered for anything that may happen, and spell out the scope. What is Pelican actually doing on site with the drone? What are you picking up? If it's a specific unit, obviously let them know, but let everybody know in general too. But without all that, you're extremely right on point that everybody's afraid of these things, even if you hear it, and here it comes, and it's coming after me.
Neil, I always recommend to my associations, let the professionals do their jobs. I would never recommend that a volunteer board of directors decide to purchase their own drone and operate it. A lot of them have problems operating their meetings, let alone flying drones around the community. So it would be my recommendation, hire a company like Chris's and rent the drone for the day, make sure the contract covers them in terms of potential liability. But that would be my recommendation. So, Chris, I want to ask you, like every other piece of technology, it accelerates rapidly. How rapidly has drone technology increased over the last 5 years? And where do you see it heading in the next 5 years?
It's been a huge advancement in the last 5 years. Just in battery technology alone, we've gone, as Neil touched on earlier, it was about 10, 12 minutes was the average flight time. Our latest drone that we purchased a few months ago is over 40 minutes of flight time, and it's smaller, if you can imagine that. So the capabilities have expanded. The resolutions are a little bit clearer, the video resolution back from the drone and so on and so forth. The payloads have expanded immensely. We've seen manufacturers come up with lighter weight lenses and smaller LiDAR units specifically for the purpose of drones. But ultimately where we're headed and what this means for our future experiences around drones, it will get more streamlined in areas that you may not even notice already in the background. I was at Sam's Club the other day, and there was what's usually a floor cleaner with a person behind it. There was a floor cleaner with no person, and it was a big one, the size of a desk or so. And I, of course, had to go walk over and see if it was, going to pick me up and things like that. So we're already starting to see it. There's just not huge waves about it sometimes. In addition, security is something we're seeing drones heavily implemented for future use, where once we get beyond regulations that require line of sight of the drone, ultimately what would lead to potentially delivery case scenarios and these security drones being able to go out based on a motion sensor being triggered and send somebody a photo on their phone and say, oh, it's just a wandering animal or something. So I see a lot in the beyond line of sight category of drone evolution. I also see, of course, the technology getting more versatile with AI, and possibly you could treat a drone almost like an Alexa, drone, go take a picture of this beautiful sunset and then, come back.
That's some next level stuff with AI. Actually, I'm sure you both read the recent story about the New York Times reporter having that conversation with Google's AI platform. But these are devices that are unmanned, so you're controlling them remote control. But imagine AI controlling it as opposed to a human. That's next level stuff, Chris.
Yeah. In drone racing, it happened the other day that an AI drone beat a drone racer on a course indoors, and it was just fascinating to watch the evolution of some of this stuff. So yeah, it's there.
What's the different power sources? Obviously batteries. Are there any solar powered drones?
There are solar chargers out there. As far as endurance packages for drones, they do have little small hybrid generators, that very small engine apparatuses that perhaps for let's say a power line inspection drone where we want that extra oomph, we could have that generator kind of recharging the onboard batteries. In addition to tethered drones, we talked briefly about storm response. One of the coolest drone response tools that rolls out after a large impact area is cellular tower drones. So where there was a cell tower that was perhaps taken out by tidal surge or wind, the AT&T or Verizon network folks will come in with their tethered drone and they'll tie in a power line and a network line from the base of that tower, and they'll put it to the drone, and the drone will just sit there all day and night emitting a cellular signal for the residents that are in that community trying to get back up and running with basic needs. That is one of the really cool tools that could be a tethered solution for ongoing power.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people view drones, unfortunately, in a negative light, right? It's an invasion of privacy. Yep. And Neil's waving his hands. And I certainly see that perspective. But you've mentioned a number of things during this episode of where drones can be really helpful.
Yeah, it's really something else to see where creative minds lead the journey next in the helpful side of drones. And again, going back to, they're not just the flying ones like we're seeing at the Sam's Club cleaning the floors. We're also seeing during COVID, we saw some robot servers in restaurants that are programmed to go from the kitchen to the table and deliver that food. So we're already seeing a lot of benefits, but it's not necessarily associated directly to the flying drone stigma.
So how did you both get involved in this space? Neil, I'll ask you first. How did you get involved? I mean, by the way, you're involved with so many things, environmental, but how did you get involved with drones?
I had a land use client who back in 2011, 2012 had a newer model of DJI Phantom that they wanted to use in their operations, outdoor operations and monitoring. And back then, under the old law, Section 333, you had to file a petition, take several months, get a certificate in order to operate. So there weren't a whole lot of them. And back then, I think we were probably number 120 or something like that. And so there weren't a whole lot of licensed operations going on. Things were still a little expensive. Technology wasn't that great, but better. It got better soon after that. But Congress was pushing FAA to come out with the regulations to make it easier to integrate the drones into the national airspace, navigable airspace. And I also was over at a conference in Florida and went to a reception outdoors. There were fireworks and whatnot, and something was hovering above my head, I guess about 30, 40 feet, which I thought was an airplane way off somewhere. But I kept looking at it. I did not hear the whir that you normally hear with a drone. But, being involved, I knew exactly what it was. I saw it dip down and land on a beach nearby. I jumped over the railing, went over there. It was gone. When I found the pilot, I asked him, was he certified? Had he been through the process? Extraordinary. Back then, it was time consuming and too complex. And he said no. And so I came out with a card and said, call me if you need me. And got a call right after that.
So do you own a drone, Neil?
I own several.
I was going to start with a leading question and say, so how many drones do you own? But I thought I'd just ask if you own one. So you own several.
I own several, but I really enjoy the nanos, the really small ones.
Chris, how did you get into this space?
So I had recently moved to Pensacola from Memphis, and I was basically just browsing on YouTube, and I came across this video of drone videography in relation to a beautiful mansion for sale in Los Angeles or Laguna Beach or somewhere over there. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is just amazing way to look at a property and catch your eye. And I said to myself, wow, that could be a really great technology here in the Gulf Coast region of Pensacola. We have, the beautiful beaches of Destin and 30A and Pensacola. And so you've got some decent, opportunities to present this technology to the local community. So I started out actually reaching out to a drone company that was already set up here because my background was sales. And I said, goodness, if I don't have to reinvent the wheel here, I could do some good right off the bat. And turns out I stumbled onto a gentleman that had no desire to be licensed, had no desire to have insurance. That is one of the perks of getting licensed is you're now eligible for insurance. And the path was clear that, if somebody's not going to do it right in our neighborhood or in our part of Florida, then somebody needs to step up to do it right so that you can gain that corporate relationship with folks like Gulf Power and some of the hotel providers and so on. So ultimately, we went after that very elaborate and complicated process of what was called the 333 exemption at the time, before the Part 107 commercial drone license program was available. And luckily for us, I was not a sport pilot, but I was thankful that Pensacola is home to the Naval Flight Training Center for all pilots, whether helicopter or fixed wing. And I was able to bring guys over from the Navy for very affordable meal coverage and food coverage there to just stand next to us. It basically was that the pilot in command could be observed by the pilot. So we were able to keep our compliance in check during those beginning days. And ultimately, it evolved into what the clients wanted more of, which was the education started to evolve, that drones could now do mapping, drones could now do, a variety of things for sale, the agricultural uses, the list goes on and on. So the list of the menu items expanded with Pelican. And here we are today offering a huge variety of services that I didn't even know we would be offering when we started 8 years ago.
Do you service all of Florida, Chris, or just Central North? Yeah,
we're going to be more the Panhandle region. We do have some partner networks that are in the South and Southwest Florida region. So if you did have any questions, of course, we could help point you in the right direction. We will be spending some more time down in South Florida under our new business, Rocket Drones, which is drone education for middle through college students. And we've recently accepted our invite to Kaiser University down in West Palm Beach. And they're excited to launch the Rocket Drones program, which will ultimately lead their students with certifications that go along with their degrees to be the graduate with a little extra drone cert and versatility in the workforce.
Can I get an invite to one of these drone races? This sounds fascinating to me.
You bring your drone.
It is.
I'll bring my non-existent drone. I have to get a drone first. Any final words and where people can find you? Neil?
Yeah, Hand Arundel Harrison Sale is our law firm. I'm in Mobile. We've got offices in Santa Rosa, Panama City Beach, Destin, and it seems like we're moving east across Florida. But anything at any time, contact me.
And any final words about drones, Neil?
Drones are here to stay, that's for sure. Look up, look out, watch out, pay attention to the law.
Chris, any final words about drones and where people can find you?
So drones are certainly here to stay, like Neil mentioned. I would recommend for those that are interested in learning more about drones that there is a wonderful organization by the name of AUVSI. It is basically the Association for Unmanned Systems International. And that association has a great website. I believe it's auvsi.org. And it goes into the water drones, the ground drones, aerial drones, and all of the uses that are coming out and being revealed now and or concepts for future stuff. So that's a great resource if you are curious to learn more. And of course, here at Pelican Drones, though we don't have offices in the South Florida region, we're happy to help point you in the right direction if you do have any questions at pelicandrones.com.
I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. I am always looking around, so I will. I'll keep my eyes out. And thanks again for joining us. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to follow and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, or visit takeittotheboard.com for more ways to connect.